Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our session. Before we begin, I would like to do some introductions of myself and my colleagues. My name is Caitlin Lamonti. I use the pronouns she and her, and I serve as the Director for the Office of Inclusion Education within Student Affairs.
I am Miranda Washington, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am a substance abuse prevention specialist and an inclusion education assessment specialist in the University Health Services and the Office of Inclusion Education.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Agustina Marconi. I am the epidemiologist at UHS, and I am a medical doctor.
So we are going to get started with our presentation. As you were coming in, we were showing some slides of microaggressions that students had reported through our color of drinking process. Here is sort of an outline or overview of some of the things we're going to talk about in this presentation in this time that we have together. The color of drinking survey and data from it, because that's where the microaggressions are housed, campus climates and health impacts, and then what we can do and leave some time for questions, thoughts, concerns, and reactions. So where we've gotten a lot of our microaggressions is from the color of drinking survey, which this came from students' request of asking me as the alcohol coordinator and alcohol EDU person about, well, Rianda, can you look into the impacts of alcohol on secondhand impacts for students of color, specifically discrimination and harassment? And so we have done 2 color of drinkings. The first one was done in 2015, and the second one was done in winter 2017 to 2018. And so the goals of color of drinking were to examine the impacts of UW's alcohol culture on undergraduate students of color. And we looked at the internal and external effects to students of color, what they endured at UW because of the alcohol culture, including microaggressions. For color of drinking 1, we did as a census of undergraduate students of color, and we did in March 2015 through May 2015, and it was a 10.8% completion rate. We didn't give incentives, but we asked in general about microaggressions, but we focused on microaggressions that students experienced because of alcohol and had them define and tell us those experiences. We were not certified as research back in 2015, so when we decided to redo the study in 2017 to 2018, we did go through IRB, and we did a census of undergraduate students of color, a sample of white undergraduate students. Everyone got a $5 Amazon gift card, and we went through IRB. But we also wanted to look at all experiences with microaggressions, not just the ones that were caused because of alcohol, to have an understanding of where this falls into the context of what things we're looking at with our students. Color of drinking measures a lot of things, but we were really looking at microaggressions as microaggressions. How we defined microaggressions for the survey is we used the Sue et al. Version, where it's a brief, commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Based on this definition, we only ask students of color about experiencing microaggressions and wanting to highlight and elevate their voices in a survey about what their experiences are. Color of drinking is a mixed method survey with a lot of qual, so that we gave students the ability to be able to share their stories in their own terms and their own words.
So as Rianda explained previously, we decided to do a census of the students of color in 2018, and we sampled white students. For the purpose of this presentation, I need to make a clarification. We collapsed the answers of witnessing and experiencing microaggressions at UW Madison. So for witnessing, we used yes and unsure versus no, and that's what we are going to see. And for experiencing, we used sometimes all of the times versus no. We developed a further analysis for the microaggressions piece, and we are in the process of publishing a manuscript. This is a logistic model that uses the multinomial approach. We are only going to show the descriptive analysis today, but I need to tell you that our final model, it is in line with the descriptive approach. So as you see in this slide, there are not many differences in terms of experiencing microaggressions for students of color in the first color of drinking and in the second one. For witnessing and experiencing microaggressions for the entire sample, we observed that almost 8 out of 10 students for the total sample witnesses at least one event of microaggression. If we open the races, we can see that those who experience witnesses the most are African American students, and the least are white students. And when we open the races for experiencing microaggressions, we also see that African Americans are those who experience sometimes or all of the times more microaggressions than the rest of the group. Of course, white, it is removed from the analysis because it is not in the definition. When we add the school year, we observe that students, like older students or students more advanced in their career, seem to have witnessed and experienced more microaggressions than younger students. This is in line with the literature. We've read a lot of literature, and that shows that graduate students or more advanced students witness more microaggressions, and this could be linked to the fact that there is a cumulative experience about witnessing or observing or experiencing a microaggression during the years, and also to the fact that students could have qualitative changed their perception about microaggressions through the years. And I believe that is a very interesting research question for the future to see what happens with students along the years and working with the microaggressions definition. Again, we observe that students that consider leaving the university, yes, or are unsure, they witness and they experience more microaggressions. This slide is in line with what Rionda exposed yesterday about sense of belonging. One of the variables that we analyze is sense of belonging as well, and it is indicative that students with lower sense of belonging score higher for witnessing and experiencing microaggressions in our final model. Of course, this is a cross-sectional study. We cannot there's no directionality here because this is a cross-sectional study, but it shows a lot.
Now looking into the qualitative analysis of what students mentioned when we looked at their microaggressions. And in the colored drinking booklet, which is in the resources section, on pages 22 and 23, you'll see a lot of these, as well as page 15. But I'm going to talk about some of the top themes, because when we talk about microaggressions, we don't necessarily talk about what it is that students are talking about experiencing and what experiences specifically they're calling out. So from our qualitative analysis, after asking the students to detail your experiences with microaggressions at this university in the box below, as I was using Qualtrics, examples can include but are not limited to alcohol-related experiences, classroom interactions, on and off campus living, and etc. So students could write anything they wanted to, and because we incentivized it and had the IRB approval, we told them that this would be publishable and shareable. So the first sort of category that a lot of the microaggressions fell into, and we got 493 responses to this question, it's all qualitative, was harassment based on students' race, ethnicity, or assumed race or ethnicity. And here are some examples of some of the quotes that fell into this category. And quotes could fall into multiple categories throughout the analysis because multiple things were mentioned. But you can see from one student, I am Asian American. Sometimes people will say to me, well, you're basically white, or ask me, do your eyes ever affect how you see? From a Black student, a lot of people in Wisconsin stare sometimes. I feel like just because I'm Black, they say things related to our culture. Hair, clothes, music, forms of cultural appropriation that make me feel uncomfortable at times. I think a lot of people say things and don't mean it and mean things that are just no culturally aware because they never had to experience being a minority. So what students are showing here, and as these examples shows, is that people are saying things based on what they look or appear or making assumptions about their race. The second category, where most of the microaggressions fell, were in the classroom interactions, talking about with professors as well as classmates as well as TAs, and how that was making students feel in their time here. So one student said, professors mostly, one has commented on how articulate I am. Another professor accused me of plagiarism, which I didn't do because she didn't think I had the capabilities to write well. I sometimes find in my classrooms that people often choose to ignore me or turn to a different person when given time to discuss certain topics. I have to go out of my way to talk to others, but even then I can sense some individuals do not feel comfortable talking to me. And so when we put this with a lot of things, even some of what I mentioned in our belonging presentation yesterday, how this adds to students feeling like they belong, feeling safe, and having different interactions of, is something going to be said to me in the classroom, which is the main reason our students are here on this campus. The third category, and because alcohol was the basis of the full color thinking survey, were alcohol-related microaggressions. And because a lot of the research doesn't show secondhand impacts to the community or the communal impacts, it's mostly about the negative consequences to the drinker itself. But here are some students experiencing and telling things that they've experienced on our campus. I have been frequently confused with other South Asian students who do not look like me by intoxicated people. One time, a very drunk white guy, a college student, told me he rules Saudi Arabia, where I am not from, and used the N-word. I've heard lots of white students use the N-word. I've frequently heard people complain about their TA's accents. I've been harassed by presumable straight white men because I am queer. Another student said, I've been told to remove my turban at sporting events by other attendees. At house parties and bars, people will often touch my turban without permission. I've been called a terrorist, a towelhead, Arab, and other slurs before. And so because color thinking was looking at the alcohol-related microaggressions, and 48% of the microaggressions reported, and that stayed true for both, were alcohol-related, where people around or on campus said something to them mean-spirited or worse because they were drunk. And then the final category out of the top, and in the booklet there are more in our analysis, but stereotypes about race and ethnicity or assumed race and ethnicity of a student. So the student said, always asked about where I'm from, get remarks and threats made at me because of being Mexican. I've had people make fun of me right in front of me because I'm Mexican, being asked if I'm an illegal immigrant, or if anyone in my family has been told that I'm going to be deported. From another student, people often walk up to me and ask, is it okay if I use the N-word in songs? Or ask me questions about rap, slang, clothing, as if I'm the all-knowing authority in all things Black. People also attribute any athleticism I have to my skin color. In class, when talking about race, many people look at me as if they need to be made sure that they aren't offending me, and when they need to decide whether to say Black or African American. So sort of summarizing some of the main points from this section, African American students reported experiencing and witnessing microaggressions at 3 times more the rates than other racial groups. Undergraduate students of color are more likely to experience microaggressions the longer that they are at UW-Madison. And students of color who were considering leaving UW-Madison had a higher likelihood of experiencing microaggressions. Now, because microaggressions can impact health, we're going to look at some other campus climate data and also some of the health impacts and how they accumulate for specifically students of color, because we are looking specifically at racial microaggressions for this presentation. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of data sources, and we will send the updated slides into the chat so that people can follow the links if they want more information about the different surveys that I'll be talking about. But I'll be mentioning some things from the Campus Climate Survey in 2016, of course, color of drinking from the winter, the AAU Sexual Assault Survey, our Healthy Minds Survey, and the American College Health Assessment National College Health Assessment, Association Health Assessment. So, looking at other discrimination that students experienced, and this is from Healthy Minds from 2019, 44% of students were discriminated against in the past year. And the question was, in the past 12 months, were you treated unfairly because of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or cultural background? And 44% of all these students who were discriminated against in the past 12 months, American Indian, Alaskan Native, African American, Black, and gender diverse students experienced the highest rates of discrimination on campus. And students who face significant stigma for whom negative stereotypes strongly exist reported more discrimination in the past 12 months. Further, if they hold more marginalized identities, there were higher reports of discrimination, with 20% with no marginalized identity to 75% with four or more marginalized identities.
So as Rionda said, we have multiple sources of data that show differences in specifically experiencing discrimination or harassment. So at the beginning of 2021, we developed UW-Madison participated in the NCHA data. And this data shows, this is weighted data that shows that around 23% of students of color reported some type of discrimination. We are going to see later on. This was a very particular moment in time. So if we open, we are still analyzing this data, and if you open it into the different racial categories, we might see some differences from historical data due to the Asian students being harassed during 2020 and 2021. But basically, the discrimination is much higher in students of color than in white students.
Okay, looking at negative impacts to environment, 53% of all students felt that campus environment negatively impacted their health, and African American students had the highest rates of experiencing that. Students for which there exists significant stereotyping or stigma reported that campus negatively impacted their mental health, except for international students who have different cultural perspectives, but just showing that there's a range for everybody and thinking about the environment. So then the other piece, and this is also from Healthy Minds, 23% of students observed conduct or communications directed towards a person or group or people that created an exclusionary, intimidating, offensive, and or hostile working and learning environment. And disparities were found for the marginalized identities below, but for students who self-identified racially, for Black and African American students, for Hispanic and Latinx students, gender diverse students, students with a registered disability, and LGBTQ plus students. When we look at the 2016 Campus Climate Survey, the question was asked, have you experienced or witnessed hostile, harassing, or intimidating behavior? And students of color had higher rates of witnessing hostile, harassing, or intimidating behavior on our campus.
So as I mentioned, the NCHA data had some specific questions related to COVID-19 pandemic and the campus climate, the discriminatory or harassment situations around campus during 2020 and 2021. we are still analyzing this data, but of course, 60% of the students of color witness some type of event like this, and almost 25% experience some time of harassment or discriminatory situation. I need to say that again, that if we open the racial categories into the experiences, the discriminatory behaviors, the percentages change during 2021 due to pandemic. And of course, Asian students were the vast majority. But to close a little bit with our analysis, the color of drinking model showed that basically African American students suffer from at least one event of microaggression in 7 times higher than the rest of the categories in a very significant manner. So this is something that we need to study in depth in the future.
So now moving on to sort of the health impacts and sort of corroborating a little bit of what Agustina was seeing here from ACHA, from our Wisconsin and our first year students. We asked them about what their impacts were COVID. A lot of Asian students reported experiencing racism before coming to campus, and we're hoping that they wouldn't experience as much coming into our environment. When we start looking at depression, and this is based off of the PHQ-9 from Healthy Minds from 2016 and 2019, we see that students of color have higher rates of experiencing depression on our campus than their white peers. We also look at anxiety. Students of color still have higher rates, for the most part, than their white peers of experiencing anxiety on our campus as well. And this was using the GAC scale to measure students with anxiety, or GAD, sorry. Then when we start looking at victimization, and this is from AAU sexual victimization, what we see is that women of color report having higher rates, with the exception of Asian women, of experiencing sexual violence in our environment than other groups. And then from yesterday, but for those of you that haven't seen this, this is the belonging chart, and I'll explain the scales. On the vertical axis, I have a group, a community, or social circle at UW-Madison where I feel I belong, at home, known, connected to, supported in my identity. And on the horizontal scale, I see myself as part of the campus community. What the different colors of dots mean: green is race and ethnicity, yellow is sexual orientation, red is gender identity, first generation status is blue, financial stress is pink, registered disability is orange, and transfer student status is black. But what we're seeing here, if we focus on the green dots, since we're talking about students of color primarily, is that students of color tend to have low sense of belonging on our campus, on top of higher rates of mental health, higher rates of victimization, and experiencing discrimination and harassment of various forms. So when we look at, one of the other questions we looked at in color of drinking was considering leaving. Have you considered leaving the university? And students of color were 4.5 times more likely than their white counterparts to consider leaving. And we asked why. And what we found was, for students of color, racial climate was the #1 reason that students were considering leaving the university, while white students said academic reasons. And so racial climate plays a major role, such as the microaggressions, the different forms of discrimination and harassment, and how that impacts then the second reason both sets of students leave: mental health, as we showed before. The Campus Climate Survey in 2016 asked a little bit of a separate question: have students seriously considered leaving UW-Madison? Students of color were still higher than white students, but the #1 reason for leaving was still campus climate and culture of considering leaving. And going back to what Augustina showed us, that students of color who had considered leaving based on our data had higher rates of experiencing microaggressions on our campus. So to summarize and turn this over to more of the workshop piece instead of just lecturing at you all the time. So UW-Madison students of color report experiencing higher rates of microaggressions, other discriminatory behaviors, and hate and bias. And studies show racism as a health outcome that impacts the health of people of color. UW-Madison local data shows the same trend with mental health, sexual victimization, and sense of belonging.
Okay, so the next portion of our time together will be us considering what we can do. So want to very much provide space to process some of the information and the data that was just shared, and also want to acknowledge that it is a lot. So when I remember the first time that I went through the data and considered the impact that microaggressions were having on our students, on our campus, on myself within my identities, I remember feeling lots of different competing emotions. So feeling some disbelief, feeling outrage, frustration, and also a sense of not knowing what to do or how to move forward. So want to provide a space for folks to continue to process through those emotions, and then also for us to begin to consider what we can do moving forward. So in the chat, a link is going to be dropped that is a resource that I often use both within my own time thinking about microaggressions and their impact, and also something I like to encourage folks to use when we're really trying to think about the microaggressions we have experienced as well as those we've committed, the messages they convey, the impact they have, and then finally that action piece of what it looks like to move forward. So some questions that I would consider folks to consider, to reflect on, to even be encouraged to have some dialogue in the chat around. So what is it that you need to learn and unlearn related to microaggressions? So when I think about learning about microaggressions, what they are, their impact, I also think about how much I have to unlearn in order to address microaggressions and remove them from our campus and our communities. Unlearning bias, stereotypes, different harmful messages that I have been socialized or taught throughout my life about identities that I hold as well as identities I don't hold. So doing some of that reflection about what you need to learn as well as unlearn is definitely a piece of being intentional when trying to address microaggressions. Thinking about the impact that microaggressions have had on you, as well as your community, the students that you are working with, folks you care about. Thinking about those emotions and feelings again, what are you trying to process through as you reflect on all of the data and information that was shared? What are some of those most maybe emergent or emotions at the surface that you need to spend some time thinking about in order to be able to move forward? What does building capacity look like to engage in this work? So where are you on your own journey? What resources, skills, and support might you need to start addressing microaggressions, intervening in them, and hopefully continuing to do your own education around diversity, equity, and inclusion so we can be more aware and intentional in how we treat one another? So that resource that has been dropped into the chat is an intentional worksheet that I would encourage folks to use to really start to unpack and think about addressing microaggressions that they have experienced themselves, as well as ones that you might have committed. To kind of take a broader lens on how we think about moving forward and getting to action, want to also offer folks a framework for change. So when I think holistically about the work that I need to do around diversity, equity, and inclusion, that our campus needs to consider doing, there is not just one answer. There's no one workshop, one solution, one thing that is going to address these very complex and nuanced systems of oppression on our campus, within ourselves, and within our communities. So I try to think about what I can do for self, for systems, and for skills. This is a framework that within the Office of Inclusion Education, we oftentimes use in thinking about what our approach will be and how we can identify different ways of engaging and interacting with DEI. So regarding the self, so if we are going to try to address and dismantle microaggressions and we want to hopefully shift the culture on our campus, we need to think about who we are. So how we're showing up, the identities that we're holding, our own relationship to power and privilege. Where are we with that self-work? We can't really hope to change other folks or hope to shift larger culture if we are not actively and intentionally engaged in interrogating ourselves and who we are. Connect to that then would be systems. So it is not just one person on campus that is causing oppression. It's not just one group of folks that are causing the negative impact of microaggressions on our campus, right? We have to think about the system, about the ways in which different practices, policies, and beliefs then support microaggressions and support that climate where microaggressions is a part of that and can kind of feed off of that. So important for us to think about the ways in which, as we are addressing ourselves and trying to educate ourselves and be aware of our impact, we're also thinking about the systems that we belong to, the ways in which we can shift those and challenge those. And then finally, the skills piece. So how do we grow capacity to engage in this work? That is part of learning about new resources, going to different workshops and trainings, participating in events like the Diversity Forum. And I also think about that piece of skills of growing the comfort and ability to practice those skills. So we can be engaged in lifelong learning about social justice, and at some point we have to be ready and able to act. We have to be ready to employ all of that knowledge in order to actually bring about change. So thinking about how we grow that capacity so that we can actually use those skills within our campus environment and within our communities. Which brings us to probably one of the greatest offerings I have, and that is around accountability. So how do we truly center that and use a sense of accountability to fuel our work? So accountability is really simply a commitment and willingness to take responsibility and ownership of our actions and, most importantly, our impact in how we address harm. So when I think about accountability and the conversations that I'm often in with our students as well as with my colleagues, lots of times there's fear or apprehension to be accountable because folks often think of punishment. Well, I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to own my mistakes. I don't want to be called out or called in. There's lots of times a hesitancy to be truly accountable for our actions and our impact, in particular if our intentions might be good or well-intentioned. So for me, what I have found success in is really shifting my mindset away from punishment. So me being accountable or me asking someone to be accountable for their actions is not about punishing them. It's really about showing care to my community. So when I am in my office space and something has happened and I need someone to be accountable, that is an act of love and care that I'm showing. It's much easier to oftentimes just write someone off. So I'm not going to engage with them. I'm not going to talk to them. They've done something wrong. We're just going to end that relationship. That is often less labor and less intentions in having that option. When we ask someone to be accountable, so if someone asks you to be accountable for microaggressions that you've committed, that is them in a way showing that they still want to be in community with you. They are investing in that relationship. They want to continue to be in community and to have a relationship. They just need you to have ownership of your actions and your impact. I also think about centering accountability in a change in our approach. So accountability, like any skill, requires practice. My ability to be accountable today for my impact and my actions is very different than my ability to be accountable a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I am constantly trying to practice that skill of being able to own my impact, being able to apologize, being able to make changes. That is something that I will always need to practice. And the more I practice, the more I'm able to engage in that. I've grown my capacity to do that work. And then finally, if we are going to have any sort of conversation about addressing microaggressions that we now know are impacting our students, impacting our community, impacting us, we have to have accountability as a core of that conversation. So that is how we address problematic behavior. That is how we address different systems of oppression and harm on our campus. We have to be accountable, and that accountability can lead us towards action. Another component that I would encourage folks to think about as they continue to process the data and think about their own relationship with microaggressions is really trying to tease apart safety versus discomfort. So often in my work, folks will bring up not wanting to be uncomfortable when doing diversity, equity, or inclusion work, or concerns around being able to intervene as it relates to safety. So when I'm thinking about and referring to safety, I'm really talking about a place, a space, an environment in which a person or a group can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, or really any type of emotional, mental, or physical harm. Like those are concerns of safety. That is often very different than discomfort. So when thinking about discomfort, I'm really thinking about some of that emotional resistance that oftentimes can go hand in hand with deep self-reflection and challenge. So discomfort can really show up as a wide range of emotions. So for myself, when I'm in a situation and I am experiencing discomfort, I often feel really defensive. Sometimes there's a little bit of guilt, and I also have a high tendency to want to disengage and pull myself back and away from the situation. So if I'm in a space and someone is talking to me about a microaggression that I have just committed, oftentimes I will be like, no, I didn't do that. That's not what I meant. That's not at all what I wanted to have that impact on someone. And I then want to pull myself away from the situation. Discomfort can also signify, though, that we are at a learning edge, and we have the ability, if we choose to stay engaged, if we choose to push forward, we have the ability to really learn and change and grow. So when dealing with diversity, equity, inclusion, when thinking about your connection to microaggressions, you will probably experience discomfort. It's going to ask you to really turn a lens on yourself, on your socialization, on your connection to this work, and think about what you can do differently. Think about ways in which you can intervene and ways in which you can bring about change. That is not going to be a smiley, laughy, 100% joyful experience. There will be times when you are uncomfortable, when you are experiencing that discomfort. That is often different than safety and concerns of true safety. So important to also grow our ability to be uncomfortable and experience discomfort as we engage in this work. So what will come next, we will talk about an intervention method and something that you all can hopefully begin to employ within addressing microaggressions within yourself and your communities that you belong to. So before I offer that method, would like to talk a bit about how to intervene. So I know when I first started doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I would often have role models within the work, and I would always be so amazed at the ways in which they effortlessly intervened in situations. They always knew what to say. They always knew how to act. I was always so impressed by that, but also had this feeling of, how do I get to be that person? How do I grow those skills? And so I learned that oftentimes it comes about through practice, through continual reflection and learning. And there is also a bit of a behind the scenes formula to being able to intervene. So for me, I think about you first have to be able to notice the event. So that would require us to be aware of our surroundings. Who is in the space with us? What identities do they hold? What are some of the dynamics that are happening? We have to be aware in order to catch what is going on to be able to intervene. I then think about interrupting. So that would mean, in order for me to interrupt and intervene, that I am recognizing something as problematic, as harmful, as not aligning with our values for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the space. So for me to do that, I have to also be engaged in learning about those things. So if I had no awareness of microaggressions, if I was not engaged in trying to do social justice work, I might not be picking up on microaggressions happening in the space. I might not be aware of harmful dynamics. So that is where that self-education piece really comes into play, because it helps us to interpret the behaviors, the actions happening around us. Then comes that piece of accountability. So assuming responsibility. So feeling like you can and you should intervene, that you are a part of this community, that you are accountable to our students, to other members of the community, and you are going to do something. Not someone else, but you. So having that ownership and knowing that you need to intervene. Which moves us then to that skill piece. So thinking about knowing how to help. So understanding different strategies, resources, ways in which you can intervene in the situation to de-escalate it, as well as to make sure that we are centering the person who might have been harmed. Finally is that action piece. So all of that awareness, that growth, knowing different strategies, we get to that point where we are finally ready to employ them. We are finally ready to take action. That action piece is huge. That is how we will shift the culture. So thinking about your ability and your capacity to address the situation. And so now what I will offer is probably, is it my favorite? I think it might be my favorite intervention strategy. So we will talk a bit about that. Before we get to that, some considerations. So intervening in a microaggression, intervening in another act of hate or discrimination, there are certain things that I would encourage folks to really think about as you are leading up to that. So some questions that I think about for myself: who is this person to you? Who are you to them? What is your role in the situation? So intervening in a situation where a microaggression has been done during a team meeting. So let's say you're at an office or staff meeting and a microaggression has just happened. That is a very different experience than it is a game day and you are somewhere on State Street, right? So really thinking about the folks who are involved in the situation. Thinking about how you're feeling, what are your expectations, what are you going into the situation holding on to? Is this person or this group of folks going to be open to a conversation? Again, someone that you might have a closer proximity to, a friend, a community member, someone in your office. You might be, they might be much more open to a conversation than a possible stranger or someone that you are briefly interacting with. Thinking about identities at play, thinking about who is there, who is not, what are your own values and priorities, and then that safety piece. So being able to tell if a situation is about safety or discomfort. So is your safety at risk? Is someone else's safety at risk? These are just some considerations that I would encourage folks to think through, especially if we are thinking about being more proactive and building that capacity to interact. Thinking through some of these pieces can help that. And finally, the intervention method. So the 5 Ds of intervention come from research and work around sexual assault violence prevention. They can also be used when we think about how we can address and intervene when microaggressions are happening. So this is just one of very many strategies that someone could employ in addressing microaggressions. So these Ds: direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document. I'm going to go through each one and offer some examples. So direct would be directly addressing or challenging inappropriate behavior in a safe way. So for me, that might look like me telling someone, that's not funny, that's racist. We don't use that language. That behavior is not accepted. Please stop. So I am not talking around the situation. I'm not alluding to anything else. I am direct. I am forward. I am addressing the person who is creating the harm, or in this instance is creating the microaggression. Distract would be when we are trying to pull attention away from the inappropriate behavior. We're adding in another factor that can help to physically, to offer time to physically remove ourselves and the person who's being harmed from the situation. So when I have in the past witnessed a microaggression and I'm trying to employ the method of distract, I might go up to the group where I've noticed, some conversation is going on and I've just heard a microaggression, and I might ask the question, could you help me find this building? Could you come with me for a second to take a look at this? Does anyone have the time? right? So I'm just doing something to break the tension, to have a moment where folks can remove themselves from that situation. I'm distracting in some way. Delegate would be when we bring in another community member to assist with the situation. So this is involving else, ideally someone that might have more social power or standing than you that can help to be in solidarity as we address the situation. So this could be pulling in a supervisor, this could be pulling in some colleagues, again, presenting more of a united front when trying to address the situation. I do want to note that for some folks, delegating might include them considering to involve the police. What I always like to ask folks to consider if they are thinking about delegating to authorities is the really complex and nuanced history that lots of folks and communities, in particular communities holding marginalized identities, have with the police. Our goal in intervening is to de-escalate and, most importantly, make sure the person who is being harmed is supported and no longer harmed. So if you are considering to delegate in that way, always like to caution you to try to get the approval and talk to the person again who's being harmed. If contacting the police or involving them is an option that they would want, that they feel safe and secure with, before we just make that decision for them. Delay then is really about checking in after the situation or event. This can be helpful for folks who might need some space and time to process. So what I would also encourage is that we incorporate delay into all of these different aspects. So even if I am being direct in intervening in the microaggression, I am still checking in delay. I'm still checking in afterwards with the person. There will be times when I have wanted to intervene in a microaggression, where I have known that something is wrong and is not okay, and I have not been able to do that. Maybe based on my own safety, based on my capacity, based on any variety of things. There have been times when I've not been able to intervene in a direct way. What's important for me to still think about and to still follow through with is how I check in on that person afterwards. When I reflect on my own times where I've been microaggressed and other folks have witnessed it but not done or said anything, I oftentimes take that as them agreeing. So silence can often be understood as someone agreeing with the harmful thing that has been said or done. So important for you after a microaggression has happened, even if you've not been able to intervene in another way, to still check in with someone, to still ask if they need water or support, to be vocal and intentional in saying, I don't agree with what just happened. I witnessed that, I saw that, I'm sorry. I don't agree with what that person just said or did. We have to be really clear in sharing that support with folks, because oftentimes silence will just look like agreeing with the person who has issued the microaggression. And then finally, document. So this is recording, taking notes, capturing details of the event, the microaggression, with intentions for the person who has been harmed to use that information if they need to. So this is not what I will often tell students, not to end up on TikTok or social media later on. This is truly just for the person who has been harmed. If they should want or need to fill out, let's say, a hate and bias incident report, if they should need that documentation for any reason, it's merely to support them in trying to think about what moving forward, what healing, what processing the event might look like if they should need that information later. Again, this is just one of very many strategies to intervene and address microaggressions. In order for us to utilize this strategy and this method, we also have to be doing all of that other work around accountability, around interrogating ourselves and our identity, addressing policies. It's going to take many different things in order for us truly to try to shift that culture and make our campus a place where microaggressions and other forms of discrimination and oppression are not existing, not welcome, not a part of the fabric of our students' experience. To help and support this work, want to offer some additional resources from our Office of Inclusion Education. So last year, we created in collaboration with the university libraries 2 micro courses. So these are easily accessible self-paced micro courses that folks can utilize to do their own self-learning and growth. The first is really a broad overview of social justice. So thinking about identity, power and privilege, micro-messaging, including microaggressions. And then the second is about how to facilitate and navigate conversations around race. The main lens is in the classroom, but the tips and strategies are really applicable to folks holding any sort of conversation or dialogue about race. So these, we will make sure that the links get sent out to everyone. Great resources when you are trying to do some of your own self-work that are easily accessible and again, self-paced. So you can go in and out as you need to with these courses. And then finally requesting some sort of follow-up workshop or training. So if you are trying to think about how to possibly build a more inclusive community, how to consider identity within your staff team or with your student interns or other students that you are working with, putting in a workshop request, and our social justice education team within the Office of Inclusion Education can craft something for your group. Knowing that, again, that educational piece can be really important when we are trying to build a strong foundation for us to move forward from and take action around. My final 3 questions for folks that I like to leave as a bit of a challenge, really thinking about what is in your sphere of influence, where you can have the most direct impact, and how does this apply to your work and role at UW-Madison. Really thinking about what your journey, what your work, what your impact can be. Again, it's not any one person's responsibility. I do not control all of campus. I cannot just magically make racism disappear. I wish I could. That is not a superpower that I currently hold, but I do have the ability to create change within my office, within my team, within the communities I belong to. So really important for us to think about our sphere of influence, our direct impact, and how this information relates to our role and work at UW-Madison if we, again, are going to try to work as a community to shift culture and eliminate microaggressions from our students' experiences as well as our own. Which moves us to some intentional time for questions, thoughts, concerns, and reactions. I know we have a few questions in the chat, so I will review those, and then my co-presenters will also be addressing any of them. So I'm seeing some questions around resources. So we will make sure that the most updated presentation, as well as any of the handouts that we mentioned, make it to that website that has all of the resources so that folks can have access to those. So I'm seeing a question from a bit back around how to support folks if they are dealing with microaggressions that, let's say, have happened in the classroom. And so someone was asking, what if your students are sharing about an event occurring in their classroom? Maybe if there is a lot of mansplaining as an example, how do you intervene if it's, let's say, not you or you're not there to witness it? So for me, I will oftentimes work with that student to first support them. So to be able to provide someone for them to process through that with, to validate their feelings. Sometimes it's the opportunity for me to connect them with resources around mental health and some well-being, so connecting them with campus partners and UHS if there's some additional processing and support that the student might need. And then depending on different factors, so what my role is, my relationship with the student, if this is something the student would like me to do, there are times when I would reach out to the faculty member. I think in particular with my role as director of the Office of Inclusion Education, I would probably reach out, set up a time for us to talk, try to build some relationship where I can lean in and I can hopefully work with that faculty member or that other staff person to think about what the overall climate is like in their classroom and what change might look like. Oh, great question. So thinking about how to intervene when it is someone who might be a supervisor or someone who is higher up or someone who has some positional authority. So in my experience in those situations, I oftentimes use the delegate method, but instead of referring to someone who has more social power, I'll try to build support with my colleagues. So if it's something I'm experiencing, I will oftentimes lean on colleagues who might have a privileged identity. So in the past, I've had instances where I feel like, there's been racial microaggressions and they're impacting me. I will often work with white colleagues who are allies and who are doing the work and invested in creating change, and then us together address it. And we bring it to the supervisor, the person who has power, and we're talking about it as a collective, as a group. So we're utilizing some of the privilege and positionality that they have through some of their social identities. So it takes some of the direct pressure off of me as the person who holds the marginalized identity in this example and the person who's been harmed. So it allows them to support me. We're presenting a united front to be able to address the issue. I think when it's your supervisor, there's also the option of needing to utilize some larger campus human relations resources, thinking about if the issue pursues and continues to create a negative impact on you, going to your supervisor, so elevating it and trying to have a conversation with someone who also has positional power in that instance. All would be some strategies that I would employ in dealing with that. And I'll also add to that. So when I think about the data shared and the impact that we're clearly experiencing with our students, when it is someone who I'm trying to talk about microaggressions with and they do have positional authority over me or just a superior in any sort of way, I really try to tie those conversations back to what the Wisconsin student experience is supposed to be. So I talk about, our campus's diversity statement. I talk about the overall UW-Madison student experience and that sense of belonging and connection to UW-Madison. And then I draw some connections between, if these microaggressions continue and if, students holding different identities are continuing to have a different experience, what does that say about our work and role at the university, right? So trying to kind of expand it to really think about what we are offering students holistically and how us addressing microaggressions, regardless of our titles or ranks, really truly is everyone's responsibility. So we have to be able to engage in conversations around that. So I try to tie it back to some of those things that are a bit broader and larger and more connected to the university if there is ever any resistance from a superior or a supervisor in addressing that. Seeing a few more questions. So a question from someone, I've heard or seen mention of saying, what do you mean by that? Or something along those lines when someone says a microaggression to try to get them to understand what they said was wrong. Would you consider that a direct intervention? Is that something you would use depending on the circumstances? So yes, so I am a big fan of asking someone, in particular, I find a lot of microaggressions folks try to disguise as jokes. So they think they're being funny, but they're really just being racist or sexist or classist. So I will not laugh because those are not funny. They're not jokes. They're hugely problematic. Instead, I will ask someone, what do you mean? I don't get it. Could you explain? No, I still don't understand. Could you try to explain what you just said in another way to really try to challenge them to sit with and unpack what they just said? Sometimes I will really, you're able to kind of view it on someone's face where they'll be like, oh, never mind. Never mind. Nothing to say because they have caught themselves and they've caught the inherent bias and stereotype that is hidden in their joke. So sometimes that is a strategy that I employ. So yeah, depending on the circumstance, depending on the group, and again, your relationship with them, asking for clarity, asking them to explain, what do you mean by that, can be a way to address the microaggression and then have more of a dialogue around why it is not a joke, why it's not okay to say. Seeing another question, just check time. Oh, we're good. So how do you suggest to respond to a hypersensitive person who considers everything a microaggression due to personal history? Is it a microaggression if only one person perceives it as such? Great question. I think it gets to some of the complexities in addressing and intervening with microaggressions. So my first part of that, I think has to do with that hypersensitive person part. So I find it really important for us to not judge or place or police how folks respond to harm. So the ways in which someone might respond to a microaggression might be really different than how I would respond. It might be more emotion, less emotion. It might just be different, and that is okay. We're all different folks. So how we express our emotions and our feelings is going to be different depending on who we are. So I try to do my own learning and growth around not placing any expectations on how folks respond to not just microaggressions, but to really anything in life, right? Letting folks show up authentically as themselves and respond as a way that feels true. So I try not to place any assumptions or expectations on how other folks respond. That second part of the question, so is a microaggression if only one person perceives it as such? So in my opinion, and in the work that I do, if someone who holds that marginalized identity is expressing that the way something was said has impacted them in a negative way, and the other person does not agree, we're going to always try to center the needs and the expectations and the feelings of the person who has been harmed. So I would say yes. So I have a microaggression I often encounter is folks asking me, what are you? So wanting to know about my racial and my ethnic background. That's quite a common question for me. I experience that as microaggressive, in particular when someone has not also been doing the work of building a relationship with me. So if we are getting to know one another and we're building a friendship and we're out to coffee and you ask, oh, could you tell me a bit more about your background? And you're also sharing about your history and your heritage and who you are, that's fine if we're talking about our race or our ethnicity. When someone is standing in line behind me at Woodman's and they ask, what are you? That is a microaggression, right? So it's important to think about context and setting. That person probably thinks that they are just being curious, that they're just asking a question. So they would probably not agree that it's a microaggression, but how it has landed on me is microaggressive. So yes, I would say that we don't need both parties or all parties in a situation to agree that it's a microaggression. The person who feels that they have been harmed and microaggressed, we would value that, and we would think about what it means in terms of our accountability. So our intentions can be good and our impact can be harmful and negative. Checking to see if there's any more questions. Seeing some great resources shared. See another question. So someone being curious about when you feel it might be appropriate, or if it ever is appropriate, to call people in, not out, when addressing microaggressions. So thinking about calling in versus calling out, that I feel like that's a whole nother workshop on some of those nuances there. I think it also relates to a lot of times our unwillingness to be uncomfortable in doing this work. So I try to grow an ability for folks to call me in versus also call me out. So if I am creating a negative impact, I need to be accountable for that no matter what. And for me, I don't really think about the differences in being called in versus called out, but that's not necessarily central to the question. But do I ever feel it might be appropriate to call people in? Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Calling someone in, having a discussion, I think, especially if it's a pattern of behavior, asking someone to really be accountable, having a side conversation. So I have been able to intervene in microaggressions before, where I've utilized a direct approach and told that person, no, that's not appropriate. And then based on my relationship with that person, we've had a further discussion later. I've asked them to, hey, can we grab coffee and have a 30-minute conversation? I would like to call you in about some behavior, some patterns, some work that I believe you might be able to do in terms of social justice and your impact on other folks. See, another question, can you give more examples of common microaggressions and intervening? Helpful to hear examples. Oh, lots of examples. I'm trying to filter to give ones of lower impact. So I will pull from examples that I have experienced to talk about. So one of the microaggressions that I receive often, that is often kind of hidden within a compliment. So folks will often say to me, for background, I identify as a multiracial Black person. Folks will often say to me, oh, you have really beautiful hair. Your hair is so pretty. It's not like other folks. So they think oftentimes that it's a compliment. It lands on me as really microaggressive, definitely rooted in anti-Blackness and in racism, right? I'm being complimented on something that is really harmful and discriminatory, right? And thinking about the history of colorism and anti-Blackness within our communities. So when I receive that, I will oftentimes have a direct approach and tell someone like, oh, that's a really weird thing to say. Hair is hair. Some people have it, some people don't. It's hair. When I need to sometimes use distract, so I have been places where folks will touch my hair a lot. They're like literally pull on my curls and they'll be really hyper focused on it. I will oftentimes use the distract method. So I will, turn away from them. I'll start talking about something else. I will, oh, look, there's a colleague. Hey, can you come over here? I will try to utilize distract to just pull that person's attention away so we can move away from that harmful interaction. Seeing some additional questions in our remaining time. We still have about 6 minutes. So a question around how can we give some examples of different ways students can respond to professors who commit microaggressions? Really important question. I think it's asking us to think about those differences in power and positionality and the experiences that from the data are showing that students are having within the classroom. So how I often counsel or advise students when it comes to microaggressions in the classroom from their professors. So I think about kind of the many approaches. So if that student wants or has a need, I can lean in and I can reach out. There's a hate and bias incident form, so thinking about the student's ability to report their experience and the microaggressions they're experiencing within the classroom, and then having someone from the Dean of Students office reach out and do follow-up. Oftentimes that follow-up with the faculty member looks like some sort of workshop or training or resource development from a campus partner within student affairs. I will oftentimes ask the student how their relationship is with other students in the class. So if it's a microaggression the student is experiencing, is it something that is happening for other folks as well? What is their comfort and ease with possibly approaching the professor? So if it's a group of students, are they comfortable and have the capacity to go to the professor's office hours together and talk about their concerns? Is there a possible TA or another person within the class or within the department that they might have a stronger relationship with, that they could go and share their experience and they could have that person also be a part of the team to lean in, but really try to first center the student, validate their feelings, connect them to additional resources if they should need to continue to process and need support there, and then to really think through who is best positioned to do that follow-up and to talk to that faculty member. Oftentimes, it's kind of both and. So it might be the student reaching out to their fellow students and then approaching the faculty member. That might not work, or it's not having the impact or the change the student wants. So then we think about if that behavior continues from the professor and they continue to create an unwelcome and unsafe learning environment for students with the microaggressions they're issuing, then definitely thinking about elevating it to filling out a hate and bias incident report, to then leaning on other folks with positional power to then go in and talk to that faculty member. Looking at final few questions. So a question, I have encountered issues with individuals experiencing microaggressions from an individual who says they are unaware of the microaggression and unable to help it because they are neurodivergent. Any advice on those situations? Yeah. So what I would say is that all of us are engaged in our own learning and journey when it comes to not just microaggressions, but to diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice. We all are at different points of that work. What I would encourage is having the capacity and the ability to work with that person to think about what their learning and growth could look like. So wanting to make sure that we are aware of their social identities, of their experiences as someone who is neurodivergent, and also still thinking about their role within the community. So are there different ways to offer resources, different ways to have conversations, different ways to support them as they do their own journey and create what it will look like for them in terms of learning about microaggressions, in terms of learning about their impact, right? So all of us are a part of this community. How we learn about and address and intervene in microaggressions is going to be different. We can also build a capacity to adapt and to change the ways in which we might present information or how we talk about microaggressions so that all members of the community can be aware of them and can think about what their role is in intervening and hopefully no longer issuing those microaggressions. Okay, I don't think I'm seeing any final questions. Do want to offer our contact information for follow-up. So if you should be looking for additional resources, if you should have any follow-up questions, anything, or you just want to chat about some of the great data shared today, please feel free to reach out to me or my lovely colleagues. We are definitely available and interested in furthering these conversations and really do take the approach of thinking about what we can do as a collective and as a community to address microaggressions on our campus and shift that culture. So thank you all for your time this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the remaining events and speakers at the Diversity Forum and look forward to continuing these conversations and this work with you all.